Okay, welcome to the deep dive. We're cracking open the sources you've shared with us and really plunging into a topic that sparked one of Charles Darwin's biggest intellectual battles. I mean, it apparently caused him moments of real distress.
That's right. We're diving into Darwin's theory of sexual selection, which is, the idea about evolution that isn't just survival of the fittest.
Right.
It focuses much more on the incredible, sometimes baffling beauty we see, particularly in male birds, and why this concept was so hard for almost everyone to grasp, even Darwin himself at times.
So our mission today is to pull out the sort of key knowledge nuggets from these sources. We want to understand where this really bold, pretty controversial idea came from, how it developed over time, and why it generated such heated disagreements.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. It's about beauty, about preference, scientific friction, and a really crucial distinction that, honestly, even biologists generations later would kind of struggle with.
Okay, so let's get straight into it then. One of the maybe surprising things from these sources is how this whole journey into sexual selection might have involved a key missed opportunity for Darwin right here in England, basically.
Absolutely. It seems pretty clear, actually, that Charles Darwin never witnessed a black grouse leak.
Hmm.
That dramatic display ground where the males gathered.
Leak, right? Sometimes called a balls or spell.
Exactly, yeah. Borrowing from German or Scandinavian terms, he never saw one himself.
Which seems a bit odd because he definitely knew black grouse. As a young man, late 1820s, he was out shooting them on his uncle Josiah Wedgwood's estate in Staffordshire. He even wrote letters about how many he bagged, so he knew the species well.
Definitely. And black grouse are extinct in Staffordshire now, sadly, but they were common back then. The key thing is when he was hunting them. August.
Ah.
And August was pretty much the one time you wouldn't see the males doing their thing at the lake. They were molting, looking scruffy.
Okay, but here's the really striking part, isn't it? Even though he knew about leks in general, Darwin stated in his big 1871 book, The Descent of Man, that he'd never met with any account of regular assemblages of black game in Scotland.
Or England, by implication. Yeah.
He seemed to think these big, dramatic displays only really happen commonly in places like Scandinavia and Germany.
Right. And then, just after the book came out, April 1871, this chap, David Wedderburn, writes to Darwin, specifically to correct him.
Saying he had seen a lick.
Yeah, describing one he'd witnessed in Selkirkshire, up in Scotland.
And Darwin's reaction is, well, it's interesting, maybe a little underwhelming.
You could say that. He basically just tweaked the sentence in later editions to mention this one instance from Wedderburn.
No big follow-up investigation.
Doesn't seem like it. Even though, as the sources point out, leks were actually happening in quite a few English counties at the time. But Darwin, living down in Kent where the species hadn't bred, just seems to have remained unaware of how common they were closer to home.
He also apparently picked up a slightly wrong detail from another naturalist, Brehm, thinking one male would visit multiple leak sites in a morning.
Yeah, a minor point maybe, but another sign he wasn't intimately familiar with leak behavior firsthand.
But the source flags what it calls Darwin's potential fatal mistake in all this, which was
This false impression, based on the limited accounts he had, that female black grouse do not actually attend these leaks.
Ah, okay. And why is that so crucial?
Because if Darwin had actually hidden out and watched a leak himself, if he'd seen the females there, quietly observing, watching all these males going frantic.
It would have been direct evidence.
Powerful, direct, real-world evidence for the most radical bit of his sexual selection idea, that females might actually be the ultimate authors of all this male extravagance, through their choices.
An idea that very few people were buying at the time.
Exactly. Active female preference driving evolution. That was a tough sell. A later naturalist, Edmund Selès, who did watch leks, actually lamented this, wished Darwin could have seen it.
Darwin did mention somewhere that the display was a call to females, and that females which are present are thus charmed, right?
He did note that from one account, yes. But he didn't seem to take that leap to connect being charmed with active evolutionary choice by the females.
Okay, so the first key knowledge nugget here. A potentially crucial piece of the puzzle, seeing female choice in action at a leak, was basically missing from Darwin's own experience in England, which probably didn't help him convince others.
Definitely didn't help.
And this whole idea, sexual selection itself, it wasn't just tacked on later, was it? The sources show it had really deep roots, even family roots.
Oh, absolutely. The historian Eveline Richards uncovered that young Darwin, back in the 1830s, was almost, obsessed with sexual selection. And crucially, He saw it as something completely separate from natural selection for survival.
And a huge influence seems to have been his grandfather, Erasmus Darwin. Quite a character, apparently.
Oh, Erasmus was something else. A physician, inventor, poet, polymath, and a real free thinker. He was remarkably open about the sexual principle, about love and desire being fundamental forces. Much more frank about sex than Victorian society generally allowed.
And in his book, Zoonomia, from way back in 1794, he wrote something that sounds, well, pretty prescient, doesn't it?
It really does. He talked about the contest amongst the males and said the reason for it was to ensure the strongest and most active animals should propagate the species, which should then become improved. It's basically forerunner of Charles's idea.
And Charles definitely latched onto this, even if he perhaps downplayed his grandfather's influence later on, maybe because social attitudes had shifted.
Quite possibly. But by April 1838, his notebooks show him wondering if species got improved because more vigor was given to the offspring from these contests. He mentioned seals and deer fighting over females.
And he put this idea, male combat improving the stock, into his early 1844 essay, the first sketch of his theory, saying, the most vigorous and healthy males must generally gain a victory.
Right. And then came the big conceptual leap. Charles started thinking, okay, if combat works this way, could beauty work in a similar way?
And what's really fascinating is that the initial spark for this idea, selective mating driving change, it didn't come from birds at first, it came from observing people.
During the Beagle voyage in the 1830s, Darwin was really struck by human diversity, but also by how different groups seemed to sexually prefer their own kind.
He noticed women he didn't find attractive were clearly attractive to men of their own race.
Exactly. And that planted a seed. If sexual preferences differ between groups, and if those preferences affect who reproduces, then over generations, it could actually make those groups look different.
That is sexual selection, right there, in humans.
Precisely. He even used his own preferences, famously preferring perfect English angels over the nice round mermaids, his term for Spanish ladies he encountered as a kind of illustration of how preference works.
Okay, so that was the human angle. Then birds came into it.
Just a few days later, according to his notebooks, September 1838, he starts pondering peacocks displaying. Were females just most attracted? Could birdsong be a sign of vigor, like strength in combat?
And then he dives into philosophy, aesthetics.
Yeah. October 1838, he's reading Sir Joshua Reynolds, Edmund Burke, thinking about beauty.
What did he get from them?
Well, from Reynolds, ideas about universal beauty versus different cultural standards, like Ethiopian races having different ideals. And from Burke, this strong link between beauty and the erotic, with sexual attraction.
And then came the really radical bit.
The huge leap. Darwin starts wondering, is appreciating beauty only for educated gentlemen? Could other creatures, specifically female birds, also have some kind of aesthetic sense? Appreciate beauty?
Because beauty seemed mostly visual, for humans and for birds.
Right. And by March 1839, it crystallizes in that famous notebook line. We must suppose peahens admire peacock's tail as much as we do.
And the peacock becomes the icon.
The absolute emblem of sexual selection. Because that tail is just so spectacular, but seems so useless for survival.
So another key nugget then. The initial flash wasn't birds. It was human attraction. Diverse preferences driving physical differences. That's where the idea started.
And when Darwin finally wrote down his theory properly in that 1844 essay, sexual selection was right there from the start, alongside natural selection.
How did you define it then?
He called it a second agency in animals with separate sexes. A struggle of the males for the females. Sometimes decided by the law of battle, sure, but also, especially in birds, by the charms of their song, by their beauty, or their power of courtship.
Okay, so to build the case, he then looked at areas where selection was undeniable, right, like domestic animals.
Exactly. He started talking to breeders, like Sir John Seabright, an MP, an acute observer, famous for creating the Seabright Bantam chicken.
The one where the male looks like the female?
That's the one. Very unusual plumage. And Darwin used this in Origin of Species in 1859 as an analogy.
The logic being,
if a human breeder like Seabright could create specific traits, even beautiful ones, through selection in a relatively short time, then surely female birds, by selecting during thousands of generations the most melodious or beautiful males, might produce a marked effect out in the wild.
He also got really into pigeons around this time, didn't he, in the 1850s?
Oh, obsessed. Joined pigeon clubs, bred them himself, studied them intensely. He was fascinated by how the wild rock dove could be transformed into all these incredibly different breeds tumblers, fantails, powders, purely through human selection.
And again, drawing that parallel.
Yes. If pigeon fanciers could breed these fancy varieties just by picking the ones they liked, couldn't female birds effectively breed fancy males by picking the ones they liked?
He even had a friend, John Eaton, another pigeon fancier, who compared the beauty of his favorite almond tumbler to lovely women.
Right, but you see the problem, right? This analogy was a bit of a double-edged sword. Well, if you say selection by a fancier creates beauty, and then suggest a similar process happens in nature, doesn't that kind of imply a conscious selector? A creator?
Yeah. It plays into the hands of the natural theologians, the creationists.
Exactly. It left him vulnerable. Which brings us to that very famous quote, the peacock's tail.
From the 1860 letter. The sight of a feather in a peacock's tail, whenever I gaze at it, makes me sick.
Right. And it's crucial to understand why it made him sick. It wasn't that he didn't believe sexual selection explained it. It made him sick because it was such a massive problem for his natural selection theory.
Because it wasn't useful for survival.
Worse than useless. It seemed flamboyant, wasteful, maybe even a dangerous burden. Makes the bird easier for predators to spot, harder to fly.
So if nature was full of these spectacular but seemingly pointless ornaments, maybe natural selection, with its focus on utility and survival, wasn't the full story.
Exactly. It felt too utilitarian, maybe, to explain something that seemed purely about beauty for beauty's sake.
Okay, so that's a critical distinction. The peacock's tail sickness wasn't disbelief. It was because it resisted explanation by natural selection alone. It actually pushed him towards sexual selection as a separate force.
Precisely. It became a huge motivator for promoting sexual selection.
And this is where his critics, coming from that natural theology background, really pounced, right?
Oh, yeah. The standard view, then, the creationist view, was simple. Beauty in nature. God put it there to delight mankind. Simple as that.
A circular argument, but hard to disprove directly.
Very. And Darwin's critics hammered him on his inability to explain the utility of things like the peacock's tail. Why should beauty matter in evolution? He wrestled with this hugely in the 1860s, asking other naturalists for help.
And he started adding things to later editions of Origin to counter this.
Yes, by the fourth edition in 1866, he's directly attacking the idea that beauty exists only for humans.
Pointing out things like beautiful seashells existing long before people.
Exactly. Seashells, flowers beautiful for bees, berries bright for birds. This human-centric view just seemed illogical, solipsistic even.
But bird plumage was still the toughest nut to crack.
The hardest case, he called it. How do you explain that purely utilitarianly?
So what was his eventual conclusion?
He stated it pretty plainly. Many male animals, including all our most gorgeous birds, have been rendered beautiful for beauty's sake. Full stop. But, and this is the crucial bit, this has been effected not for the delight of man, but through sexual selection.
That is from the more beautiful males having been continually preferred by their less ornamented females.
Precisely. He locates the appreciation of beauty not in God or humans, but in the female animals themselves.
But that nagging question remained, didn't it? Why? Why would females continually prefer beautiful males? What was the underlying reason for that preference?
And that's where he didn't have a wimple, catch-all utilitarian answer, which left the door open for his biggest challenge. And surprisingly, it came from his closest scientific ally.
Alfred Russel Wallace, the co-discoverer of natural selection.
Right. Now, others had criticized the idea before Wallace. The Duke of Argyll, for example, attacked Darwin in a book in 1867. He asked how natural selection explained different hummingbird crest colors. Was topaz better than sapphire for survival? A fair question, really.
Even Charles Kingsley, the novelist, who defended Darwin against the Duke, sort of hinted that female charm might be involved.
But it was Wallace's doubts that really hit Darwin hard, found them most woundingly, he said.
Why Wallace specifically?
Because Wallace, his co-theorist, just could not accept that females possessed the necessary taste and the agency to select mates based on subtle differences in beauty.
He questioned the peahen's taste. Why, like a veil of eyes?
Exactly. How sophisticated could a bird's aesthetic sense possibly be? It just didn't compute for Wallace.
And Darwin was really disappointed by this.
Profoundly. When Wallace first voiced these doubts back in 1864, despite their huge mutual respect, despite Wallace's incredible generosity about who got credit for natural selection, this became a fundamental point where they just couldn't agree.
So Darwin decided to double down in The Descent of Man.
He did. Devoted nearly half the book, published in 1871, to making the case for sexual selection. still using that analogy of animal breeders arguing female birds could shape male beauty over time, just like a breeder endowed the Seabright bantam.
And it's worth stressing again that core point. Darwin saw sexual selection as fundamentally different from natural selection.
Absolutely vital. Natural selection, differential survival. Sexual selection, differential reproduction based on mate choice. And they could even oppose each other, like a beautiful tale making you less likely to survive.
The sources mention even later biologists struggled with this distinction. A student in the 80s couldn't get it.
Yeah, the anecdote is about a student just refusing to accept that reproduction of the sexiest was different from survival of the fittest. It's a subtle but crucial difference that Darwin saw clearly.
And a big reason he pushed sexual selection so hard in Descent was human races.
Yes. He felt natural selection alone couldn't really explain human racial differences. He needed sexual selection, different preferences in different groups, over long periods to account for that diversity, tying it right back to those early Beagle observations.
Initially, Wallace seemed somewhat on board, didn't he, in his book The Malay Archipelago?
He did, briefly. In 1869, writing about birds of paradise, he suggested their incredible colors might be produced by selection by the females of those male birds which were more than usually ornamental.
But then he changed his mind, or hardened his position.
Yeah. Correspondence from 1868 shows him really digging in. How could females possibly notice and prefer tiny variations, like an inch in the tail of a peacock? It seemed to him it would require big, sudden jumps, not gradual change.
And Darwin had that sharp reply, the whisker analogy.
The famous tart reply, yeah. Darwin basically said, look, a woman chooses a handsome man without getting out a ruler to measure his whiskers. She judges the overall effect. Maybe peahens do too, judging a peacock's overall, more gorgeous appearance.
But Wallace later used that against Darwin.
He did, devastatingly, in his 1889 book, Darwinism. He said, okay, a woman might admire whiskers, but that doesn't prove the whiskers evolved because of her admiration. His central point never changed. There is no proof whatsoever that slight differences in that display have any effect in determining their choice.
So what were Wallace's alternatives? Why did he think males displayed?
He suggested things like it just being an excess of enthusiasm, or maybe bright colors, were simply for species recognition, helping males identify rivals or females identify mates of the right species. More functional explanations.
They also argued about birdsong versus beauty, right?
Yeah, Wallace pointed out that many really colorful birds, like peacocks and grouse, have loud but pretty unmusical calls, while the best singers, like nightingales, are often dull-colored. He saw this supporting his view color and song were functional signals, maybe serving different purposes.
But Darwin saw it differently.
Darwin flipped it. He argued the nightingale's beautiful song was basically an audio version of a peacock's tale. It fit his theory perfectly. No need to look flashy if you sound good. It was still about charming the female, just using sound instead of sight.
Okay, another major point of disagreement was the color of the females.
Right. Wallace was convinced. Dull female colors were the result of natural selection actively favoring camouflage, especially for females sitting on nests. Makes perfect sense, intuitively.
But Darwin resisted this.
Increasingly so. He found the idea of females being specially modified for camouflage very doubtful. He even took Wallace's examples, like peahens and capercaillies, out of later editions of Origin.
Wow, he was clearly bothered by it.
Oh, his letters show real frustration. He wrote to Wallace, "It has vexed me much to find that the further I get on, the more I differ from you about the females being dull-colored for protection."
Why was he so resistant? Camouflage seems logical.
It's tricky. Part of it might have been his own slightly confusing ideas about heredity back then, his pangenesis theory. It made it hard for him to visualize how natural selection could act strongly on one sex, females for camouflage, while sexual selection acted on the other, males for ornament.
Maybe he also worried it weakened his own theory.
Possibly. If natural selection explained female dullness and potentially male survival traits, maybe it would crowd out his preferred explanation for male beauty, which was sexual selection. The sources suggest this disagreement became almost an obsession for him around 1868.
They even had a meeting about it, a summit.
Yeah, at Darwin's home, Down House, with Wallace and a couple other naturalists, Weir and Blythe. We don't have minutes or anything, but the letters suggest the others kind of ganged up on Wallace.
Trying to convince him.
It seems like it.
They got into some apparently confusing arguments about red feathers, trying to argue that male ornament came first, evolutionarily, not female dullness.
Did it work?
Not really. Richards, the historian, suggests the meeting probably just hardened their differences.
The debate kind of petered out after that. They basically agreed to disagree. Very politely, of course.
There was that clever butterfly analogy later, though.
Ah, yes. From George Fraser in Nature in 1871, studying blue butterflies. He noted the undersurfaces, seen when resting, were dull, clearly camouflage. That's for Wallace.
But the upper surfaces?
Bright blue, mainly on the males, shown off in flight or courtship. That, Fraser said, must be for charming female. That's for Darwin. His line was great. We may give the undersurface to Mr. Wallace, but we must yield the upper surface to Mr. Darwin.
A perfect summary of their split views. Which brings us, perhaps, to the ultimate test case, the biggest puzzle, the great Argus pheasant.
Indeed. Introduced to Darwin by an artist and naturalist, Thomas Wood. Wood had seen birds courting. He saw the peacock display was aimed at females, but like Wallace, he just couldn't swallow the idea of female choice driving it. He thought the sheer beauty pointed to a great artistic power in nature.
And the Argus pheasant was his trump card.
His ultimate example, a huge bird from Southeast Asia. The male's wings are covered in these incredible circular patterns, eye spots, ocelli, maybe 150 on each wing feather.
But the really mind-blowing bit was the detail in these spots.
The shading. Each ocellus is shaded to look three-dimensional, like a little polished ball sitting in a socket. But, and this is key, only when the feather is held at a specific angle. Wood described it as being painted with consummate skill by an artist.
And Wood just couldn't believe. What?
Couldn't believe that birds could appreciate this level of optical illusion, or that something so intricate could evolve out of the flesh of a poor bird for the sole purpose of fascinating his lady love. He felt that kind of refined taste belonged only to the highest civilization.
How did Darwin react? He saw a specimen initially.
Yeah, a stuffed one, and it looked flat, unimpressive. But then the ornithologist John Gould explained. The live bird displays by holding its wings up vertically like a huge shield. And in that position, the way the light hits the shading...
Makes the spots look 3D?
Exactly. They pop out. Apparently, even human artists admired the technical skill of the shading.
But this became ammunition for Darwin's critics.
Oh, yes. An anonymous reviewer of Dissent mocked him mercilessly, compared the Argus ocelli to Raphael's Madonnas, and basically caricatured Darwin as saying a hen Argus pheasant has the aesthetic powers of Raphael.
How did Darwin defend this?
Forcefully. He pointed out the argument from incredulity cuts both ways. Was it really easier to believe a creator painted these optical illusions just for human amusement? He spent pages in Dissent showing plausible gradual steps in how ocelli could evolve from simpler spots seen in related birds. No supernatural explanation required, he argued.
He even got Wood to draw the display for the book.
Commissioned him, yes, based on a bird in the London Zoo. The drawing shows the male exploding his wings into this huge cone aimed right at the female, making the point visually. This beauty is for sexual charm and for no other purpose.
A powerful image, but despite all this, the direct proof of female choice actually happening remained elusive for Darwin.
It remained frustratingly thin, as he admitted. Wallace, remember, knew the wild Argus. He said it was shy, camouflaged the very species that first shook his own belief in sexual selection. How could females be choosing based on displays they rarely saw?
And decades later, others felt the same. William Beebe.
Yeah, Beebe, the explorer, in the 1920s. He struggled massively to even witness the Argus display in the wild, and he basically came to the same conclusion as Wallace. The hens can't do aesthetics, and the beauty seemed lost upon the nonchalant little hen. Beebe just threw up his hands and said, I do not know.
But more recently, we have learned more.
We have. Scientists like Jeffrey Davison in the 70s, Tim Lemon filming incredible footage more recently. We have now seen the display properly, this throbbing, shimmering hemisphere of wings. It's stunning.
And there was that study with chickens?
Right, 2022, University of Exeter. Show that domestic chickens' close relatives can perceive the 3D illusion in images of Argus ocelli, suggesting birds do have the visual capacity. Richard Dawkins had done earlier work showing chicks respond differently to 3D illusions if they're lit from above, like the ocelli are.
Okay, so maybe birds can see it, but why evolve optical illusions?
Good question. One idea is sensory exploitation. Maybe the male display taps into a pre-existing female bias. Maybe they're wired to pay attention to sphere-like shapes because they look like fruit or eyes.
But the problem with that is...
It doesn't explain the sheer variety of ornaments, does it? Black grouse legs don't look like fruit or eyes. Why so many different forms of beauty?
And there's another challenge, isn't there? For birds like the Argus that display alone.
Exactly. The solitary displayers. Argus, capercaillie, sometimes called an exploded leek because males are spread out, various other grouse, pheasants. The male sets up his spot, displays alone, chases off rivals. How does a female compare potential mates if they might be miles apart? It's not like a leek where she can see multiple males performing side by side.
So lots of questions remained, even though Darwin gathered examples from all over the animal kingdom.
Oh, tons. He talked about newts, fish, insects. He noted dragonflies and damselflies, bright males, dull females. And in damselflies, females have clear control over mating, suggesting the male colors might indeed charm them.
And insects making music.
Right. Crickets, grasshoppers, bugs using musical instruments, rubbing body parts together, stridulation to call or excite the mute females.
But back to birds, where the displays are often most spectacular. Despite this mountain of examples of male ornament, the direct evidence for active female choice
remained thin. Even his own trusted correspondents, the careful and experienced observers he relied on, mostly wrote back saying they just didn't believe females preferred certain males because of their beautiful plumage.
His pigeon guy, Tegetmeier, wouldn't even try dyeing a bird to see what happened.
Yep. Didn't seem to think female choice was plausible enough to warrant the experiment.
So what little evidence did Darwin cling to?
There was one story, which he himself called flimsy evidence, from Sir Robert Heron, about his peons back in the early 19th century. Apparently they showed a great preference for a particular pied peacock kept in a cage, gathering around it, ignoring a normal Japan peacock that was roaming free.
And when the pied one was removed?
The next year, with the pied cock gone, they accepted the Japan male. It's ambiguous, observational, but it was one of the only hints of actual female preference he had.
So faced with this lack of direct proof, what was Darwin's main counter-argument?
He kept coming back to, why else? Why would males evolve these incredibly elaborate, often costly, seemingly useless displays and ornaments if they served for no purpose? His argument was logical. If females are simply more likely to mate with charming males, even slightly, than over generations, those ornaments will inevitably evolve and become more elaborate.
He had that analogy, didn't he, about an alien?
Yeah, the alien observing a country fair. The alien sees young men dressing up, singing, competing, showing off, and sees young women responding, eventually pairing off. The alien could infer the girl's power of choice just from observing the interactions, without needing direct access to her inner thoughts or aesthetic judgments.
A clever way to put it. So how did this all land? How was The Descent of Man and its big focus on sexual selection received at the time?
Well, Wallace, despite his major reservations, wrote a generally positive review initially. He praised the incredible detail Darwin had amassed and acknowledged sexual selection as Darwin's unique, striking creation.
But he didn't change his mind on the core issue.
Not at all. He stuck to his guns. Couldn't accept female taste and the agency for beauty. He worried such capricious taste would lead to unstable speckled or piebald results, and he held firm that female dullness was about camouflage via natural selection.
And then there were more hostile critics.
Oh yes, St. George Mivart, who was a much more belligerent reviewer. He'd been a Darwin supporter, but converted to Catholicism and turned quite critical. Mivart basically rubbished The Descent, using Wallace's critique as support. He claimed there was no fragment evidence for female caprice driving evolution.
He really disliked the idea of female choice.
Seemed to. Dismissed it as unpredictable, based on vicious feminine caprice. He even tried to reject Darwin's point about different racial beauty standards by appealing to the supposedly universal Hellenic ideal. Mivart's review definitely got under Darwin's skin.
And Darwin's usual allies, did they jump to defend sexual selection?
Surprisingly few did. Thomas Henry Huxley, Darwin's bulldog, fought Mivart tooth and nail on other evolutionary points, but he mostly steered clear of sexual selection. Herbert Spencer dismissed the idea that music evolved from males charming females. He preferred his own theory about an overflow of energy.
Why the reluctance, do the sources suggest?
Partly, perhaps, the sheer difficulty of proving female choice, but maybe also, as the sources hint, the increasingly strict assumptions of late Victorian society about human relationships played a role. A certain reticence among gentlemen about accepting that females might be the ones actively driving sexual encounters and evolutionary change.
Even the publisher was nervous about the word sexual.
Yeah. Apparently got cold feet about sexual in the title The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. Only allowed sex initially.
Interesting. Though some women might have seen it differently. George Eliot.
Possibly.
Some scholars suggest novelists like George Eliot, exploring women's choices and agency in novels like Middlemarch, might have found some intellectual resonance with Darwin's ideas about female influence, even if subtly.
But the overall take from the intellectual establishment at the time.
Largely, sexual selection became Darwin's slightly embarrassing idea that ought to be quietly forgotten. An idea that, as these sources make clear, even biologists well into the 20th century would continue to struggle to understand or fully embrace.
And that really brings us to the end of this deep dive. It's been fascinating tracing this revolutionary idea that Darwin championed, despite his own moments of doubt and pretty fierce opposition.
Yeah, we've gone from his grandfather's influence and that potentially crucial missed black grouse leak through the surprising link he made between human preferences and animal beauty, the intense intellectual sparring with Wallace, and that incredible puzzle of the great Argus pheasant.
It really underscores just how bold Darwin's concept was, doesn't it? Identifying sexual selection as this force fundamentally separate from survival of the fittest, driven instead by who gets to reproduce based on mate choice, shaping beauty in ways that seemed, well, completely impractical from a survival standpoint.
And it shows why this history still matters. The struggle to really grasp and accept female agency and evolution was clearly difficult, even for brilliant minds like Darwin and Wallace back then. It still forces us, I think, to question our own assumptions about beauty, about purpose in nature, about who or what is really driving all the incredible diversity we see around us.
So maybe here's something for you, the listener, to think about as you go about your day. Just look around at nature, sure, but maybe even at human interactions, culture, attraction. Consider all the seemingly extravagant, maybe even useless beauty you encounter, the bright colors, the complex songs, the intricate patterns, the flamboyant displays. How much of it might actually be the result, subtle or not so subtle, of ancient ongoing preferences. Preferences for charm, for beauty, for vigor, preferences that have profoundly shaped our world, even if we don't always consciously recognize them doing